Just 2 games into the regular season, and everyone is talking about the Toronto Raptors rookie class. What did we miss, and how do we miss it? But I think it's important to understand how we got here. And that's what this episode is going to be about, how we got here, and whether all of us are maybe overreacting, or perhaps Masai Ujiri really deserves a lot of credit for what exactly has happened. The Toronto Raptors walked into the draft lottery with a coin toss shot of keeping their sixth overall pick, which became eighth and was conveyed subsequently to the San Antonio Spurs. They also walked in with a mid first, but due to a series of disastrous coin flips, tiebreakers, they went from 16th to 19th. Can you hear me shaking my head? And they also walked in with a 31st pick owed to them by the Pistons via the OG Anunoby trade, which felt like a bit of an afterthought, but now that we've seen what they used it for, seems like a deal breaker. At the midseason mark, following the Pascal Siakam trade, a teary eyed Masai Ujiri took the podium. It was a trade in which they conveyed a sentiment that holding this many picks in a draft this week would likely be too many rookies to develop at once. And that's where I think Masai Ujiri fooled us. This cued a trade for Ochai Agbaji and Kelly Olynyk with the Utah Jazz, in which the Toronto Raptors gave up their OKC pick, and ultimately they loaded up. They unloaded a pick in the draft, following the logic that it was too many. Then they traded at the draft. They traded Jalen McDaniels, since waived by the San Antonio Spurs, since traded by the Kings, for Davion Mitchell, the 45th pick and the future Portland second. I think I would not be in the minority to say that the Portland second was the most appetizing part of this deal. But it seems that the Toronto Raptors might have had their eyes really set on that 45th pick to draft Jamal Shed. At the draft, the Raptors picked Jakob Poeltl at 19th, stunned the naysayers by grabbing Jonathan Mobo at 31, and believe me, there were plenty of critics. Plenty of critics. They took Jamal Shed at 45th when he pretty much forced his way to the Toronto Raptors because he had an insistence that he didn't want to be a two-way player. And then they bought a 57th pick to nab Ulrich Shamshay, a player who really hasn't played very much right now, but a player whom I remain very high on. They also brought in Jamison Battle, who later converted into a two-way from the undrafted heap, an underrated late bloomer who shot 43% from three on high volume in the Big Ten for the Ohio State. This is the story of how the Toronto Raptors basically found 5, at worst, role players and real NBA players from nothing, and how the development staff and an open-minded coaching staff are creating a new wave youth movement in Toronto. This is a fun team, and we're going to enjoy every second of it. Well, that scripted intro didn't go super well, but hit the like if you want me to get speech therapy sessions. We're going to be very structured in today's live. We're going to be pretty condensed because I don't expect a lot of people to go through a 3-hour live and, get all those thoughts. And because we're breaking down the game and what happened, maybe we miss the bigger vision of what we're doing. We just hint at it. So today we're going to talk about that bigger vision, and we're going to talk about these young players, and we're going to talk about what they actually can be for the Toronto Raptors and just why I am so bullish on them. So first, I think it's important to realize how we got here. And how we got here was a series of decisions made by this front office. Number one, the decision to tear it down, the decision to pivot away from a surefire, sustainable idea, which is having players like Pascal Siakam, OG Anunoby, bringing them back. Obviously, once Fred VanVleet left, you were cap flexible enough to max out those two players and not completely blow your cap. The idea to move OG Anunoby, a very valuable player and a player who has since garnered a lot of recognition for what he's done in New York, to move that player for a couple of maybe hypotheticals in RJ Barrett and bench guard Emmanuel Quickley, plus the 31st overall pick that would become Jonathan Mobo, it could inevitably go down in history as one of the greatest trades in Raptors history. I'm not kidding. I think Emmanuel Quickley is that good. I think RJ Barrett is just that good. And I think Jonathan Mobo will be that good, that you basically end up with 3 starter level players, or at least high rotation level players, for one very bloated asset, which became OG Anunoby. I think it's also important to remember that the Toronto Raptors were very criticized, heavily criticized, for moving off of that OKC pick. I remember at the time I didn't mind it too much. I thought Ochai was worth a flyer, but of course Ochai came out and he wasn't very good. And you wonder what happened to that player we saw in Kansas. It's also important to realize that Kelly Olynyk has not played a single minute for you, but he's going to help a lot, and that you got him in that deal as well. A lot of people were very stressed, myself included, about the pick that we were losing. And as we moved closer and closer to the draft lottery, I remember saying, I don't care. I remember saying that. I don't care. I don't care. I went week after week. People were panicking. I said, I just don't care. I don't care if we lose this pick or keep this pick, because if we lose it, then we have nothing to worry about going forward. And if we keep it, then we're probably going to get a great player. I also remember thinking this draft isn't that strong, but I remember going on here saying, wait, it's deep though. It's really deep. Too many times we look at a draft at the very top and we judge it and we classify it as a strong draft or a weak draft. But in every single draft, there are plenty of role players, and we'll talk about those role players, but those are valuable players. Those are the types of players that win championships. When the Golden State Warriors won a championship, when the Boston Celtics won a championship, they don't win a championship without Rajon Rondo. The Golden State Warriors don't win a championship without Draymond Green. Now, those are the best levels of role players. But think about players like Andrew Bogut. That's a role player. He went first overall, but that's a role player. Role players, if you listen to Draymond Green, who is the ultimate role player and possibly one of the greatest role players of all time, if you talk to someone like Dennis Rodman, guys who played this role at a very high level. And let me know if you hear a buzzing with my audio. Do you guys hear a buzzing? I'm hearing a buzzing. It's bothering me endlessly. Anyways, when you have Rue saying Rob Yonalo, Kasia, how are you doing? I'm hoping we are done with the Bruno experiment. We are not. We are not. But nevertheless, let us continue. Let me know if we're getting any buzz on the audio, and I'll step out and step back in. This has been a clunky live already, but it's going to get smoother as we go. Don't you worry. So I think that it's important to realize that all these role players are effectively what win championships. If you listen to Draymond Green, he always says it's like the guys from 5 to 9, and he's not lying about that. That's exactly what wins championships. Of course, the stars are the stars. When you get an injury, when you get even, a little bit nicked up, you get into foul trouble like the Raptors got into last night, you're going to have to call on your 9th, 10th, 11th guys. You don't win those championships without Sean Livingston. And obviously, Sean Livingston doesn't win those championships, but he doesn't adjust himself from the high lottery pick to the role player. The Toronto Raptors took a chance on two guys that we're not really going to talk too much about today, in Ochai Agbaji and Davion Mitchell, who were both lottery picks, who maybe some people projected as starters, who the Raptors are more projecting as role players and maybe salvageable role players. That's a valuable asset. Oftentimes when you see stars being traded, it's usually for a bucket full of draft picks and role players. And role players are the finishing pieces on a championship puzzle. The Los Angeles Lakers right now could really use some better role players. They could use some advancement from their young players, and I think they are off to a really good start. A good example of role players is what the OKC Thunder and the Golden State Warriors are doing. Now, the Golden State Warriors notoriously messed up a lot of drafts. They really did. They messed up the Jonathan Kuminga draft. I believe they messed up the Jonathan Kuminga draft, passing on Franz Wagner. They messed up the draft in which they passed on LaMelo Ball for James Wiseman. They made a lot of mistakes. Even Moses Moody, the jury is out, but Trey Murphy certainly would have been a lot better. So they basically messed up draft pick after draft pick. But last year, they did something really amazing. They drafted Trey Jackson Davis 57th, and they drafted Brandon Podziemski in the middle of the first round. And nobody batted an eye because those are somewhat underappreciated rookies. Brandon Podziemski was one of my favorite rookies coming into the draft class, alongside Jaime Jaquez, alongside guys like this, because they had NBA skills. And that is not something to be taken for granted. To be able to lock in NBA skills on a 4-year rookie deal is very invaluable, especially when you have some bloated contracts on the other end of your roster. And that is a roster building philosophy that I don't think a lot of people understand. But these older rookies that come out after 4 years, 3 years of college, they in theory are overlooked because they have a perceptive lack of upside, but they don't really, and they don't always. There's nothing necessary about that. Jimmy Butler was considered to have a lack of upside. He has grown by leaps and bounds. Kawhi Leonard was deemed to have a lack of upside. Pascal Siakam was deemed to have a lack of upside. None of these guys were 4-year seniors, but they were older players. They weren't freshmen when they came out, and they blossomed exponentially. So you have to be a real sleuth. I think that the Toronto Raptors did a fantastic job since the Scotty draft, basically, of drafting. They've been on a roll, right? Now, obviously, Delano Banton didn't work out. Do I still see the potential in Delano Banton? Hell yes, I do. I do. Basically, it was just the Malachi draft. That's the only thing that I can really point to and say that wasn't it. But since the Scotty draft, this team has been on a roll. They traded away a lot of first round picks to get here. But in this draft, in which we had the president of the team basically and every single pundit telling us this is a weak draft, we had to be cautious and say, zig, zag. I've said it before and I'll say it again. In order to succeed in the NBA, you must be a contrarian and you must be right. The Toronto Raptors decided to be contrarians because if they truly believed that this was a weak draft, holistically, from the bird's eye view, total top down, if they believed this was a weak draft, there was no reason to sign 5 rookies out of this class. And they waived one to sign the other one. So they had 6. They had 6 in camp, 6 rookies in camp. That's a team that's going very young. That is a team that is batting on some NBA readiness from these young players. That is a team that is looking to put these players in positions to succeed or fail. And there's no consequence here. You're taking so many swings at it. You know, all of us, when we look at the Toronto Raptors trading away these first round picks, we're like, what the hell are you doing? What are you doing? These are such valuable assets as a lottery pick. But what good is a lottery pick if you spend it on James Bouknight? What good is a lottery pick if you spend it on a James Wiseman? Not to just keep picking on James, but if the lottery pick doesn't work out, it's just a busted asset and it's really expensive. These lottery picks make 10, $11 million. The successful franchises like the Miami Heat, the OKC Thunder, they're finding value way deeper in the draft. And the Toronto Raptors have done just that. So they walked into draft night with very little to show. They walked in with a lot of bearish sentiment because, you know, obviously when that 8th pick went off, we're like, that was our pick. We gave it away for Jakob Poeltl. We saw, guys like Zach Edey going off the board, and we're like, man, I'd rather have Zach Edey than Jakob Poeltl. And I remember feeling like, oh man, are we really going to lose out? And I was very high on that 13 to 16 range in the draft. And then we fell to 19 and I was like, man, we're going to miss out on that too. So it felt like a lot of bearish sentiment and it didn't. And if you walked into the draft thinking this was going to be a draft of nothings because we had the 19th pick and the 31st pick, you wouldn't be alone. Most people felt that way. Most people felt like this draft wasn't worth paying attention to. The 19th pick isn't worth paying attention to. And the 31st pick almost always amounts to nothing. But I'm here to tell you that in a draft that was supposed to amount to nothing, there were a lot of role players. And I believe you've correctly identified 5 of them. Let's move on to the next part. So that's really how we got here, right? Why is this impressive? This is a 2-game sample size. I studied stats, so I know that a 2-game sample size does not a career make. I know that. However, it is impressive for a multitude of reasons. The first reason it's impressive is because you don't really have anything to elevate this offense. These players like Jamal Shed, Jonathan Mobo, Jamison Battle, all of these guys, Jacoby hasn't played yet, Urish hasn't really played any minutes of consequence, but all of these guys are the types of players that would benefit from better teammates. There's not one guy on this team who is the type of player that's like playing out of a phone booth like a Cam Thomas or a Jaden Hardy, where you're like, oh, when better teammates come back, they'll fall down to earth. No, actually, I think guys like Grady Dick and guys like these rookies, Jonathan Mobo, are going to be much better playing off of an RJ Barrett than they are playing without him. So that's one reason why it's so impressive. The second reason it's so super impressive is because rookies are not supposed to impact winning. I'll give you a stat that's going to blow your mind, and I'll caution you that it is a very small sample size. But Jonathan Mobo has been box plus minus positive in both games. A game in which we were blown up by 30, he was positive. He was positive 0.3 box plus minus in that game. I'll tell you another stat that's going to blow your mind, and it's Jonathan Mobo related. Jonathan Mobo led the West Coast Conference last year in box plus minus. A number that jumps out to you because there's a number of quality players in that conference, even though it is a slightly weaker conference and it's not the Big Ten and it's not the Big East and it's not the SEC. Okay, fine. But it is still a conference in Division I basketball, and he was the best player in that conference per my estimation, per the numbers. He was great. but still we had draft analysts saying his numbers don't stick out because he didn't make a three in college basketball. Well, I'll tell you what, he led that conference in box plus minus. He currently leads his rookie class in box plus minus. And here's a stat that's probably going to blow your mind. With a 6.3 box plus minus, Jonathan Mobo leads the Toronto Raptors in box plus minus. It's very impressive. You're not going to play Andre Drummond every single night, but you're also not going to play Evan Mobley and Jared Allen every single night. You have had elite guards. Now, someone said to me, caution, Rob, we've only seen it for 2 games. Relax. I'll tell you what, when you, as a 6'7" rookie big wing, can switch out to Tyrese Maxey and block his jump shot from a standstill, not from a running start, from a standstill. You're sliding your feet with Tyrese Maxey, one of the shiftiest, quickest guards in the league, and you can block that shot. I don't need to see you against Jalen Brunson and Jordan Poole and D'Angelo Russell, because if you can do it to him, you can do it to literally anyone. When you can sky over Andre Drummond, jumping his best, out of position, and grab a rebound and tip that to Jamison Battle the way he did last night, I don't need to see you rebound against every single big in the league. That's a great litmus test. And unless you stop trying, I have already seen enough in 2 games to tell you 100% definitively that this is an NBA player. This is an NBA player. If you can do that to him, at some point, I expect you'll be able to do that to just about anybody. That's the way it goes. Jamal Shed, when you can split a double after you have had 7 turnovers and you are gearing up for 8th, and you're splitting that double between a veteran guard like Kyle Lowry, who is very smart and understands angles defensively very well, and is super foul baity and the most annoying basketball player you could probably ever play against, and Kelly Oubre, when you can do that and then go downhill and attack a big like Andre Drummond, when you can do that and then make a quick read and dump off to Jakob Poeltl, and it's with 1 minute to go in the 4th quarter in your second NBA game, I don't need to see you play out a whole season to know that you're an NBA player. I know these guys are all NBA players. And here's the thing. That's the point. They weren't supposed to be. A 45th pick is not supposed to turn into an NBA player. If he turns into an NBA player, it's a very good thing. A 31st overall pick is rarely supposed to turn into an NBA player. Go through the history of 31st overall picks and tell me how many of them had a career longer than 3 years in the NBA. It's very rare. It's very rare. The average draft breakdown, if you've studied drafts like I have, and I'm very obsessed with drafts, you know this every single year, I get very, very obsessed with every single draft. When you look at the average draft and how it breaks out, it's basically like you can get 2 all-stars and maybe a couple role players in the top 10. You're going to get maybe 2 to 3 role players and maybe 1 more all-star between like pick 11 and pick 40. And then maybe you'd be lucky to get a couple of role players, maybe 3 role players between 41 and the undrafted heap. It's very rare that a draft produce more than 3 all-stars. It's very rare that a draft produce more than 25 serviceable players. Most of these are a crapshoot. It's a coin toss. They're supposed to fail. It's impressive because they're succeeding early. It's impressive because they're succeeding without any expectation that was placed on them in preseason. You know, when we walked into preseason, RJ was healthy, Emmanuel Quickley was healthy, Scotty was healthy. These guys were all healthy. Bruce Brown was the only guy who was supposed to be out. So when we walked into preseason, if you're a Jamal Shed or you're an Ochai Agbaji or you're any of these rookies, you're probably looking at it like, I'm probably going to play in April. It's impressive to me that they were ready to play right now and that they've played so well. Okay, let's move on from why this is impressive, because that's why it is impressive. Chuck Hayes meets PJ Tucker. These are important archetypes. The greatest Vasquezes of the world are important. The Patrick Pattersons of the world. We found this out actually as a fan base collectively when we traded Rudy Gay for 4 really decent role players. That trade was viewed as highway robbery for the Sacramento Kings, but it wasn't, because what we got back was value across the board. A guy like John Salmons, a homeless man's LeBron James, if ever there was one, a guy who can kind of do it all, play make a little bit. You got smarter passers. Gravis Vasquez was one of the most underrated passers in NBA history. Patrick Patterson was a decent passer as a big. Chuck Hayes was a very serviceable role player. You just got great connectors all across. You got good connectors and finishers. You know who else is a good connector and a finisher? Jonathan Mobo, Ochai Agbaji, Davion Mitchell. These are all Chuck Hayes and PJ Tucker types. Okay. Will they blossom into more? Anybody's guess. Your guess is as good as mine. But right now, they have NBA skills. And that is really rare. The best league in the world. When you're 22, you have a skill that gets you on the board, that gets you on the court succeeding. That's not supposed to happen. Okay. So yes, it's supposed to happen for a lottery pick. It's supposed to happen for Cade Cunningham and Scotty Barnes and Evan Mobley. Yeah, within year two, you're supposed to be productive. You're supposed to have an NBA skill, whatever. But it's really difficult to succeed in the NBA when you're young. It's really difficult to the point where if in any draft there's like 3 rookies that didn't hurt your win total, it's a win for that draft class. Okay. They're very rare to have a 2024 draft class where you have Chris Bosh, who's positive, LeBron, who's positive, Melo, who's positive. I think Kirk Heinrich was positive. That's the rarest of rare draft class. There, it's not surprising when you see a draft class where every single rookie is negative boxes minus, negative win shares, negative across the board, because rookies make mistakes. Rookies have physical growing to do. This is the part of it. You know, when I say that Bronny James is not a top 1,000 player in the world, hell yeah, there's a lot of rookies who are not top 1,000 players in the world. That's that's never why a rookie is drafted. You'll draft a guy like Ousmane Dieng if you are the OKC Thunder, when that guy might, at the moment, not have been a top 1,000 player overseas. But you see the vision, you see the potential, and you pray that 1,000 can come to 500, can come to 200 because there's potential. Potential, potential, potential. Alex Sarr is not a top 5 he's not a top 500 player in the world either. He just went second overall, you know? But the issue here is you have rookies, if you're the Toronto Raptors, that have a role right now, and role players are valuable. We think about stars. We think about the Cooper Flags in the next draft, the AJ DeBonces in the draft following that. We think about, the VJ Edgecombs. There's a really good chance every single player I mentioned, with the exception of AJ DeBonce, becomes a role player. You don't know that Cooper Flag's going to turn into a star any more than I do. You can project. You can say he's going to be the best version of a role player. He's going to be Draymond Green, Andre Kirilenko plus plus plus. But you don't know he's going to find star advantages. It's rare to find stars. Very rare. Dylan Harper could be a 6-man career. VJ Edgecombe could be a spark plug off the bench. We don't know these things. All we know is ESPN's talking about these guys. Draft analysts are talking about these guys. There's a reason they're talking about them, because they need clicks. They need ad revenue. They need you to believe the hype. They need you to pay attention to college basketball. It's a machine. But you know who you're not paying attention to in college basketball? Jamal Shed. You're not paying attention to Jamison Battle. You're not paying attention to Jonathan Mobo, fresh out of JUCO. You're not paying attention to these guys because they're not who the marketing is behind. Again, zig, zag, find value where value is not obvious. The Toronto Raptors have done that, and I think that it's incredibly valuable that they have all these useful role players tied up on pretty cheap deals. The healthy sample size, again, I'll reiterate, we'll have a completely different read on who these players are after 15 games, 20 games, 25 games, 82 games. I'll guarantee you right now. Right now, Jamal Shed has been amazing for me. He is like negative 10 boxes minus right now. He's had so many mistakes. It's ridiculous. He has not been a positive contributor on the win total. He's making a ton of mistakes. Jonathan Mobo is making a ton of mistakes, even though he's incredibly positive at the things that he's doing right. When Jakob Poeltl plays, he's going to make a ton of mistakes. Don't even get me started on the mistakes that Ulrich Chamche is going to make, because he's going to make a ton as well. These are rookies. They're supposed to make mistakes. Jamison Battle is like rare in that he's not making a ton of mistakes, but he's also making mistakes. They're all making mistakes. And they're going to have a game where they're going to shoot 0 for 7 and have 4 turnovers, and you're going to think they're not NBA players. But that's why sample sizes exist, because the good and the bad are going to be outweighed. Right last night, I think Jonathan Mobo flashed a plus 9 boxes minus. I think there's going to be a game this year. I'm almost positive, because of how active he is, that he's going to have a game where he's negative 20 boxes minus. And by the end of the year, hopefully what you get to is like negative 2, negative 1.4. 0 would be fantastic, and plus anything would be insane. But that's the growing pains. That's how you grow. if right now you're just looking at it from the perspective of, is Jonathan Mobo like the greatest player in the world? No, he's not. He's got a lot of mistakes. He's got a lot of issues, and we can talk about those issues towards the end of this live. But we'll dig into some of the stuff. But yeah, peak. But that's what this is about. It's about peak asset farming, because at some point you're gonna want to trade a Bruce Brown. You're gonna want to trade a Kelly Olynyk or a Jakob Poeltl. You're gonna want to trade an Ochai Agbaji. Maybe you won't. Maybe you want to trade. Maybe you're going to want to trade an RJ Barrett or an Emmanuel quickly. I don't know what value, what trades are going to come up. But at some point, another executive is going to look at your analytics. They're going to look at your roster. They're going to watch you play against their team. And they're going to see Ochai Agbaji doing things that Jalen Suggs is doing or that Josh Hart is doing. And they're going to see the vision and be like, shit, if this guy, and maybe he's going to have a month this year, Ochai, where he shoots like 37% from three. And all those people that were super high on him in the draft 2 years ago are going to realize it's all coming back now. He's super valuable, right? Same thing with Chris Boucher. Chris Boucher is being put in a role to succeed right now, and he's looking much better than he did last year. Is he a bigger asset or a better asset than he was 5 days ago? Hell yes, he is. Because if I'm an executive that I just saw this guy gapping passing lanes, busting his ass off, rebounding, recovering on those crazy blocks, I'm thinking, yeah, I surely have $10 million of dead weight on my salary book. Do you know how many teams right now had their mid-level exception? That can be traded, by the way. So a team could essentially trade their mid-level exception for Chris Boucher right now on an expiring deal and probably compensate you a pick for it. I believe that's possible within the new CBA. So that would be very interesting. I think if you're looking at it from this perspective, longer term vision, after game 82 of this year, when you go in and you revisit all your assets, you will have grown your assets considerably. You will be able to go to a trade table with way more than when you started this. And I have to clarify, Jalen McDaniels was zero. I would have paid him $1 million to go home. He was so bad at basketball. The fact that you turned him into not one asset, not two assets, but three real assets, one of which is a pure hypothetical, which is that Portland pick, is, remember how I said that the OG Anunoby trade might go down as one of the best trades in Raptors history? That's another trade that might go down as one of the best deals in Raptors history. And I'll tell you right now, if Ochai Agbaji turns into what I think he's starting to become into, you might look back a year from now and say, yeah, that was absolutely a steal for the 29th overall pick. That's nuts. Okay, let's move on. Again, give this video a like if you like this more organized, coherent structure. The prognosticators. Where are these people? Where are these people who give these draft grades a D plus? I was reading the analysis. I was very curious because I do that kind of thing. I'm a sicko. I go and I'll read your blog. If you have a blog, if you have a URL and you covered the Toronto Raptors draft, believe me, I took the screenshot. I screenshotted everybody's coverage because I was so like high on Mobo, and I knew that a lot of people weren't. And I just wanted to see how people felt because I thought there was a sneaky amount of potential with all these players. And where are these people now? When you read their analysis, it's so lazy. When you hear people comparing Jonathan Mobo to Precious Achiuwa, you know how lazy you have to be to watch these players. Tell me you haven't seen Jonathan Mobo play by comparing him to Precious Achiuwa. You don't get it. And if you don't get it, maybe you shouldn't be evaluating draft classes and making fan bases really sad because this coverage has a lot to do with it. Let me ask you a question right now. You guys can respond in the chat. Let me know, and I'll flash your answers on the screen. If you knew at the draft what you knew now, would you have taken Jonathan Mobo at 25? Would you have taken Jamal Shed at 29? Would you have taken Ulrich based on just saying no? Okay, who would you have taken over Jonathan Mobo at no? Yes. Sure thing. Some people are saying yes, some people are saying no. I'm very curious who people would have taken over him, unless you're going to say Ryan Dunn, which I completely understand. Ryan Dunn has been another steal. I think that every one of these players was a first round pick. I think. That's my belief. I think Jonathan Mobo has shown me a lot more than a lot of first round picks. And it's not just because, by the way, here's another funky stat. Do you know that the leading scorer in this draft class, 2 games into the season, granted, very, very small sample size, the leading scorer in this draft class is Jamal Shed. The second leading scorer is the guy that I really wanted at 19, which I've since moved off of. That was Yves Missi. The third leading scorer is Jonathan Mobo, and the fourth leading scorer is a tie between Zach Edey and Jamison Battle. Mohammed Lay is saying I would have taken them higher. That's hilarious. Okay. Yeah, Ryan Dunn's been awesome. Ryan Dunn is freaking awesome. I think a lot of people are thinking they should have taken Ryan Dunn in the teens. I'm trying to tell you by the end of this year, you'll probably have some people thinking we should have taken Jonathan Mobo at 17, 18. And for the Raptors, who picked, and now, so here's the question. Let's say the Toronto Raptors had the 8th pick and they'd picked Jakob Poeltl, and let's say they'd had the 13th pick and they had picked Jonathan Mobo, and they'd had the 19th pick and they'd picked Jamal Shed, and they'd had the 25th pick and they'd picked Ulrich Shamshay. Would you feel bad about the draft? Would you feel like really bad about it? Would you feel like, oh man, what a blown opportunity getting these four? I think most of us, hopefully, would just be like, that's pretty good value. There we go. S. Antonio saying yes. Why would you have felt bad about it? I'm curious. Were there younger players, better players, etc.? Paolo is saying no. Too early, man. Hey, was it early at the draft to overreact? Yes. I don't need a full 82 games to tell you that these guys are all NBA players, and I don't need a full 82 games to tell you how rare that is. My point is D plus is going to look really stupid. Elliot Roberts saying, "Are we seeing the return of the bench mob, Rob? Back again. Love the show. Thank you." I think it's too early to say because this is too early to say. Comparing these guys, there's no guarantee that any of these guys turn into a Pascal Siakam or Fred VanVleet. But the energy, that hard work, the pace, the defense that the bench mob played with, yes, I see a lot of that. Tal Kaufman saying, "Don't forget how bad Grady was at the start of last season. It's too early to evaluate these rookies." So here's the thing, Tal Kaufman. As bad as Grady was last year, I was telling people that he's doing really awesome things. He's just not finishing. So I'm not gonna like. There's a different way to evaluate players. I would understand your criticism if you were saying like I was getting super hyped about Jonathan Mobo because he's averaging 9 points. I don't care that he's averaging 9 points. I don't care that he misses every single shot. I care that he's stuck with Tyrese Maxey on a switch and out rebounded Andre Drummond from a standstill. I care that he can block a Tyrese Maxey shot from a standstill. Like to me, that's what scouting is. I don't care if you make or miss your shots. Like Jamison Battle hit a really incredibly hard shot in the fourth quarter. I don't care if he missed that shot. I care how he took it, and I care about the separation that he had on the shot. Like I don't care about these things. Like to me, that was the reason I wasn't down on Grady last year. I was never down on Grady last year, not for 1 second. When he was in the G League, he was struggling. I wasn't down on him, and I wear a lot of pride on that because it would have been very easy for me to sell my Grady stock. I think a lot of people did sell their Grady stock, and I think if a lot of people go and revisit what they said about Grady at the time, even his biggest supporters in the Toronto media were very, very, very sour on him. They were saying he's not going to contribute for 2 years. They were saying that based on his G League performance, that he was basically like fringy bust. And they were super hype about him at the draft. I wasn't super hype about him at the draft. The thing is, you just need a critical eye to evaluate properly a player, and you need a healthy sample of work to evaluate. I'm not evaluating Scotty Barnes on his second year struggles. I was evaluating him on the player that he was from Florida State to EYBL. It matters. Who these players were before they got to the NBA matters, and how they struggle matters. See, Grady can hit every single shot, but if I saw he was just like getting blown by every single time on defense and he was lazy, I would have been concerned. I wouldn't care if Grady averaged 15 points per game, but he was like the laziest defender and the most turnover prone player because that would change my evaluation of him, right? It's not about points. It's not about staying on the court. It's not about fouling. It's not about any of that stuff. It's not about the box plus minus with these young players. I don't care that Grady was one of the worst players in basketball last year. It's how he was one of the worst players. You see, right now, and I think that this is probably exactly where we're at in the chat where we have to talk about this. So there's this 4-part process. People act like it's magic, like, oh, you found Jonathan Mobo. No, no, you scouted Jonathan Mobo, and you probably scouting him for 4 years now. It's not just when Scotty shouted him out on Twitch. Like, they've been scouting him for a while. As expressed by, they've been scouting Scotty since he was 15 years old. I mean, when Bobby Webster talked about Scotty Barnes, he was off memory able to reference things about Scotty when he was 15 years old. It was great that they were down in Tampa the year that Scotty was at FSU because they were probably able to attend a ton of his games and watch him play. Again, scout. You have to be deep, you have to be thorough, and you have to actually have people who know what they're doing. You can't have people who write off a prospect because he had a tough shooting night. You cannot have people who are so quick to judge when Scotty has a emotional outburst during a game and picks up a technical foul and gets fouled out of the game or whatever, or gives up a blow by and then he's bitching at the ref. You cannot have a scout who's so short-sighted to say, I'm writing him off. You have to understand why. Again, there's so many layers to scouting where you have to understand not only how a player like Scotty projects to a bigger court, it's the same thing you're doing with Jonathan Mobo. The toughness of conference, like, first of all, to go from the West Coast Conference up to even the SEC or the Big Ten would be a massive adjustment, and his numbers would be super different in that conference. So not only do you have to adjust how Jonathan Mobo would have fared at a much tougher conference, you also have to factor how he'll do in the NBA or even in the G League. And the problem is that's all guesswork, right? It is all guesswork. You can't guess that he's going to be able to switch and stay. You just have to be able to do the testing yourself, bring him in your gym, and then you have to actually figure out how these things translate, how some of those how some of the passing that he's doing in college level translates, and maybe in the ironic thing about Jonathan Mobo is his best games came against really bad teams. So that was the only worrisome thing about his scouting profile is that when he did face a Gonzaga, he didn't have a great game against the better teams in his conference. And that's where you start to say, well, how much does who he's playing with impact him? Is he making good decisions out of the pick and roll? Is he communicating well on defense? Is he moving his feet? Is he getting there? And is he just getting beat? You can't live and die on the results. First thing is scouting. You have to understand properly how to scout. Number two, you have to nab them. You have to get them. It doesn't matter. I don't think anyone cares anymore that Masai Ujiri had the right vision for Giannis Antetokounmpo. He wanted to get him. He wanted to get him. No, you have to go out and get it. You have to get that player. It doesn't matter that you knew who Shai Gilgeous-Alexander was and you were super high on Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. No, you have to actually nab them. You can scout all you want. Masai's known Giannis since he was, 13? Younger than that, even. He's known his family forever. He knew who this guy was, and he didn't get him. And that is a failure on our front office for not doing that, not doing enough. And if it meant trading DeMar DeRozan at the time, no matter how unpopular it would have been, I think all of us would have bitched about it for a year, and then we would have seen Giannis play, and we would have forgiven it. Masai Ujiri has had to learn the hard way the cost of not nabbing properly scouted players when you have the chance. The third step, of course, is to nurture. And that's where all the culture comes in. And that's what it was so ironic about having Nick Nurse here, because you do actually have a player in your gym who wants to get better. Ideally, if you've done the personality testing and you've done the scouting, it's a player that has a chance to succeed at the NBA level, but it's also ideally a player that wants to get better. So not only are they big enough, strong enough, tall enough, etc., to succeed through the angles and physics of the NBA, but they're also a player that's demonstrated through 4 or 5 years of scouting that they have a willingness to get better, that they have good work habits, that they have good people in their circle. Okay, so now you have to actually build them up. You have to keep their confidence high. You have to put them in positions to succeed. You have to give them bite-sized chunks of information. You can't overload them. You also can't ignore them. You can't make them feel forgotten. You can't have them lost. You need to have veterans like a Garrett Temple, like a Kelly Olynyk, like a Jakob Poeltl. He was literally explaining during the timeouts last night to Jonathan Mobo what he was doing incorrectly and helping him. He was helping him on the fly. I think at one point he even nudged him a little bit to push him into a position when he miscommunicated a screen. There's so many things that come from having good coaches and a good environment for young players to actually grow. You can buy the nicest seed in the world. If you plant it into concrete, it will not grow. It requires soil, it requires water, it requires understanding, it requires patience, it requires development, it requires skill work, it requires conversations that are difficult conversations, it requires communication, it requires clear communication of benchmarks, and then the meeting of those benchmarks, and then accountability when those benchmarks are not met. If I am Jonathan Mobo's coach and I say, I want you to win your minutes tonight, I want you to go out and hunt rebounds, I want you to push and transition, I want you to catch and go, and he doesn't do that, we need to have a conversation about what went wrong. And it doesn't need to be a conversation that will force him to shut down. It doesn't have to be a "you're a fucking idiot. Why'd you do that? You're trash, athlete." No, 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 no. It has to be a real discussion in which the athlete feels heard. Because one thing that you will realize when you have difficult conversations with anybody is they're shut down. Young players can shut down. All these athletes can shut down. They can shut down. They can lose trust. One mistake, one broken promise by you as a coaching staff, one inconsistent miscommunication, one feeling that you're not valued here, you'll see how quickly it all breaks apart. You see what Will Hardy is doing in Utah. Brilliant job. You see what Joe Mazzulla is doing in Boston. Brilliant job. You see what Mark Dagnall is doing in OKC. Brilliant job. And I think Darko Rajakovic is falling right into that mold of a guy that his players trust and he knows what he's talking about. That was something that Grady communicated last year in his pre-draft, that Darko Rajakovic, before it was ever clear that Grady was going to be on the Toronto Raptors at all, it was not clear at all that Grady was going to come to the Raptors, that he was going to be on the board. Easily, the Magic could have picked him at 11. And honestly, looking back on it, the Magic absolutely should have picked him at 11. Darko was coaching him. He was teaching him. He was giving him all these cues on like how he was struggling. Masai has been helping Ochai Agbaji for years. This is an environment in which people feel welcome, but they also feel nurtured and supported. And there's trust. There's trust that when I do well, I will be properly credited because I have a superstar on this team who is giving me credit. Did you see how uncomfortable Scotty was receiving the chain last night? He almost like he was the okay. We have seen so many players get the chain last year. We saw RJ get the chain. We saw Chris Boucher get the chain. We saw Malachi get the chain. We've seen everyone get the chain. I've never seen a player so reluctant to accept the chain than Scotty was last night. Give me a W if you felt that too. It's almost like he was looking around and he started pointing to his teammates. Paolo saying, dude, I saw that chain reaction. SP saying, I wanted to give it away. That is how you build winning habits. And you know what? If I'm being completely honest, he didn't deserve the chain. Jonathan Mobo deserved the chain 1000%. And I'm not trying to hate on Scotty. He's my favorite player. But he knew that Jonathan Mobo earned that chain. That he would have, if Scotty could have given that chain to anybody last night, here's who he would have given it to. And I'm just guessing. He would have given it to Jonathan Mobo. If he couldn't give it to Jonathan Mobo, he would have given it to Chris Boucher. If he couldn't have given it to Chris Boucher, he probably would have given it to Ochai Agbaji, maybe Davion Mitchell, maybe Jamal Shed, Jamison Battle. I think he would have given it to any one of those guys before accepting it himself. And do you know what? That's a big part of nurturing too. Scotty is, I've shared this story many times. I got my first job to afford one thing. Do you know what I wanted with my first job, my first paycheck? And it was such a sour paycheck. It was literally $5 an hour. I was working $5 an hour. Does anyone know the first thing I bought with my very first paycheck when I was 12 years old? Does anyone remember? I'm just curious. I know I've shared this story at some point. It was a jersey. It was a number 21 jersey. Whose jersey was it, though? Does anyone remember? BC. Nope. Vince Carter would have been 15, and this was before Vince Carter. Yep. 1999. I was 12 years old, and I had to buy a number 21 San Antonio Spurs jersey. Because even back then, I knew a future GOAT when I saw one. I knew a leader when I saw one, and I was enamored with Tim Duncan. Also, I was enamored with people calling him boring. People were calling him boring back then. They're like, oh, Mr. Fundamental, he is such a boring game. And I'm like, he's brilliant. This guy's brilliant. but I grew to love Tim Duncan as my model superstar. And that's probably why I like Scotty so much. He has so much in common with players that I grew up idolizing, like Bill Russell and Tim Duncan, in that he is team first always, selfless always. And that is what you want in a leader. Because when your leader is that way, when your leader is coachable, accountable, and selfless, your team will win. Find an example to the contrary, I dare you. And then finally, unlocking players. You can nurture them all you want, but at some point you must unlock them, which means all the skill work that you're doing in your 3-on-3 sessions and all the development work and all the summer training camps and all the play groups, these kids have to be able to go out and test it. And they've had a chance. They are being unlocked. Those conversations that you have with these kids, the fact that you're unlocking them as people are not stupid. Most people, the right type of people, you have to bring in the right type of people. You can't bring in the wrong people and expect good results. Like, honestly, you'd be banging your head against the wall. But the right type of people will always appreciate when you're doing well for them. That's actually a good litmus test for good people. When you pour into people, when they can see that what you're doing for them is genuine, it's not calculated, they're not trying to boost the asset, they're genuinely here to help you. And when they trust that, you will immediately unlock all the barriers to access of their mind. You will suddenly be able to ask them to try something that they're not necessarily comfortable trying, that they have never tried before, but because A, they trust you know what you're doing, and B, they trust that you would never ask them to do something against their interest, they will trust you and they will try it. You can ask Ochai Agbaji to guard in the lower third of the defense, and he's trusting you that you would be asking him that only if A, you thought he could do it, and B, that it's for his development and for his future growth. You know how you don't unlock players? You don't play them. You tell them that defense will keep them on the court. And then when they play great defense and your stars and your starters that you lean on way too much don't play great defense, they still stay benched. You create inconsistent goalposts, inconsistent messaging, and you create double standards in your locker room. You say one thing, but you mean something else. You lie constantly. You call them out in the media. You insinuate and allow them to become whipping boys of the media space because the media is trying to protect your stars. This is how you erode confidence. Maybe I should get over it, but I really do think Delano Banton could have worked out for Toronto. I really do. I really do think guys like Joe Wieskamp just needed a chance. I always have a lot of empathy for players who catch a lot of flack for their lack of development. With some players, it is totally on them. If you have ever watched, shout outs to the YouTube channel Stunted Growth, they do a great job of breaking down prospects who didn't work out. And I have found myself loving their shows because I think they're fair. They're not critical. They're not unfair. They don't sugarcoat it, but they make it clear that this player didn't work enough or this player just got injured and didn't get a chance, etc. But so much of your success and failure in life is, what do they tell you? The biggest decision you're ever going to make is the person you marry, right? Your 5 best friends, the person you marry, and the job you have are the biggest decisions you're going to make because those things are going to basically make or break your day-to-day existence. Being in a negative environment, being in a culture where people aren't talking, you remember the stories of the ghost locker room in 2021 where there were little cliques and factions. There's like 3 people over there. There's like Scotty, Gary, and Chris Boucher over there. And there's Fred and Pascal over there. And then Thaddeus Young's over there. And it's like nobody's talking to each other. And all these people have all these issues. Communication is the lifeblood of any organization. Communication matters. It matters that you meet your promises. It matters that you keep realistic goals and that people keep feeling that they're winning. You cannot have locker rooms falling apart, but you also cannot have players eroding at the end of your bench as your starters are going through the ground, and then have the media basically maligning your bench for not being good enough to play, and then having to make your stars victims for having overextended. Basically, for 5 minutes, I'm telling you that what Nick Nurse did was crazy bad for the Toronto Raptors. And it was beautiful to see the Raptors beat the crap out of the Sixers last night for that reason, and possibly that reason. If only that was the only reason, it would be enough of a reason for me. System optimization. You know what else matters? They say draft for talent, draft for talent. But talent and beauty are in the eye of the beholder. I think it matters so much that the Toronto Raptors have a building block like a Scotty Barnes and they can build everything around him. RJ Barrett optimizes Scotty Barnes. Emmanuel Quickley optimizes Scotty Barnes. Ochai, Kelly, Davion, Jamal, Jonathan Mobo, Grady. Every single decision is consistently made to make this guy the best version of himself. Bruce Brown, even in theory, is the perfect wing to put next to a Scotty Barnes if he could just shoot as well as he did in Denver. Once Scotty grows into the role of head honcho, top 10, top 15 player, all these players that right now are struggling a little bit are going to be just that much better. And what's interesting is he's not there yet. They're not there yet. And what you're trying to do is get them all together at the same time. But what if you had picked a player who just likes to go into his bag and isolate? Well, now you have oil and water when it comes to system optimization. What if you pick a big who can't defend the rim but cannot shoot? You know what I mean? Because you liked his athletic potential, but he's not a great defender and he doesn't read the court. What if you picked a big? We're seeing it right now with Bruno Fernando, who does not make good decisions in the middle of the floor, and then invested a lottery pick in him because you liked his measurables, right? You have a system, you have a coach, you have a GM, a president, and a coach who are all on the same page about who their star is, what their focus is, and what they value in basketball players. They value switchability a lot. They value positional size a lot. They value playmaking a lot. Those are the three things that I think they value most. They also value shooting way more than they used to. And if a player hit all those boxes, they would be a top 10 pick. They also value upside. So let's say that's the five things that they value, right? If a player hit all those boxes, they would be a top 5 pick. So you're going to have to pick and choose which of those things you're not going to be able to get in theory. So maybe you get the shooter like Jameson Battle, but then you have the theoretical downside of age. Maybe you get the athlete in a Jonathan Mobo who takes a lot of boxes and Jamal Shed, but they both have questions about their jump shots. Same thing with Ochai. So you try to develop the one thing that you don't in theory have right now. But in order to develop a jump shot, there has to be a base for the jump shot. With Ochai Agbaji, he was a really good shooter at Kansas. There's a base. Davion Mitchell, he shot 36% last year for Sacramento. There's a base. There's a path forward in which Ochai Agbaji and Davion Mitchell become average shooters. They're not going to become Steph Curry. That's not the point. But they can become average shooters. If they become average shooters, you win your bet. If they don't become average shooters, you don't lose your bet by much. That's why it's a good bet. Because it was yeah. And the same thing with Jonathan Mobo and Jamal Chad, right? You take them at their word that they are the players. You put them in the gym, you have them do the drill tests, you see how they're shooting, you see how they're missing, you see what the tracking, the NOAA system or whatever says about their jump shot. You see how consistent it is. You see their work ethic, and you're like, okay, I can either work with this or I can't work with this. This guy's going to be either non-shooter forever, or he's not going to be a non-shooter. And how does that fit into my system? I just think that they've got great decision makers. I think Jacoby's a great decision maker. Grady's a great decision maker. Ulrich is a great decision maker. You've seen some of the passes that Ulrich has made. These are not passes that an average 18-year-old who's been playing as long as he's been playing should be able to make. And again, if you evaluate a player before they have ripened, they're going to look like shit. And Ulrich is probably going to look really bad in G League, and then he's going to look really great in G League. I'm super high on him. I'm actually probably as high, if not higher on him than all our rookies. So be patient is what I'm saying. But all these players fit. Can you imagine how a fully realized Ulrich Shamshay fits with a Scotty Barnes? Let's see. A 6'11", super bouncy big who blocks shots, can short roll like a beast, can be a vertical lob threat, can switch out to the perimeter, can hedge and recover like Jonathan Mobo, but with way more size, has lateral quickness up, lateral quickness like you would not believe for a player his size, can run the court like a gazelle. Like, what are we doing here? Like, this is the optimal big to put next to a Scotty Barnes. You say Miles Turner. This is Miles Turner. This is Miles Turner. Just very raw, very far removed from being the Miles Turner, but maybe has a much more bigger potential as a passer than Miles Turner. I mean, again, if Ulrich Shamshay comes into Miles Turner, build a statue of Masai Ujiri outside the frigging arena. Yeah, like Miles was a frigging lottery pick. Miles is a sub all-star type of player, but Ulrich has a chance to get there, and he has the right framework and mental toughness to get there. But the point is, if he gets there, now what? Well, if he gets there, you have the perfect center for the next 10 years next to Scotty Barnes. What a steal at 57. Marc Gasol. He's just a way better athlete than Marc Gasol, man. Then there is this thing that we talked about yesterday, which is seeing what isn't there. If you understand college basketball, you understand, if you've even I mean, most of us haven't played Division One basketball. I certainly did not play Division One basketball. I thought I would when I was in grade 8, grade 9. I thought I was going down that road, but I didn't grow enough, I think, and maybe didn't work hard enough, or maybe just didn't get in front of the right scouting circles. But definitely didn't even come close to Division One basketball. But I know a lot of people who have. I know a lot of my friends played Division One. A lot of my friends even now are playing Division One or are involved with Division One basketball. You know one thing when you're playing Division One basketball, it is not about you. Okay, you are going in there to be a part of a cog, to be a cog in a wheel. Okay, and if you're a veteran, if you're a guard, like I don't know, 5'11" guard, 6-foot guard, whatever, and you fancy yourself as a three-point shooter and your coach doesn't like those shots, pull-up threes are just not coming in your game. Take one in practice and you're benched for the rest of the year. And you don't want to be benched for the rest of the year, even with the transfer portal now open to you. It's a really daunting thing. You have to fit as part of the team. And if your coach doesn't value certain things, it's the same thing with being a really good rebounder who's a little bit undersized, like a PJ Tucker. PJ Tucker played big at Texas, right? Jonathan Mobo played big in San Francisco. But these guys are wings, but they have to play big because they fill a role that no other recruit can. And so you have to imagine what they look like as wings. It was the same thing with Jakob Poeltl. Yeah, if some coach, if the Baylor coach had designed a system specifically tailored to Jacoby's betterment, he would let Jacoby run like 35 pick and rolls like he's James Harden. He would let him do pull-up threes, and he would make him way more dynamic as a player, and in the process, probably lose a ton more games, right? Now, how do you know that that stuff is there, right? Like when you take a Shaden Sharp, for instance, a guy who didn't really play in Kentucky, how do you take his high school tape and then project it forward and say this is who he is, right? This is why the scouting matters. This is why seeing kids in pickup, seeing kids during these summer runs, seeing kids when they're playing more free, seeing some of their more free natural tendencies, seeing them in high school, seeing them even as early as freaking grade school, man. Like going back to grade 8 tape of Grady Dick. It was very interesting to see the progression. You start to see in which ways their body is developing and which way their games are developing. And then you see certain natural playmaking tendencies from Grady Dick, but you're like, was he ever in the position to do that at Kansas? You see really good reads, like really swift passes from a Jacoby Walter, where you're like, how did he see that? And you're looking at him and you're like, that's a grade 11 kid. Well, he certainly didn't forget how to pass. So now I got to look at their Baylor tape and see, well, how come he had like Jacoby was basically considered a non-playmaker at Baylor, a non-playmaker. I think he had 2 assists through his first 6 games. If I'm not mistaken, it was like an absurdly small number of but if he's a finisher in that offense and he's not being asked to play make and he's almost being removed from playmaking duties, then you can maybe make the guess that he's not going to be James Harden, but you can also not necessarily say that he's definitely forgotten how to play make for others. And so you take the rules out. Then, of course, you have to imagine what isn't there in terms of spacing and the jump up to more spacing and playing with better players. Most of these players that we see in college are the best players on their team or the second best player on their team. They're not the fifth best player on the team. And trying to project how a player who's been prime number one option is going to have skills to translate to third, fourth, or fifth option, especially early on in their career before they grow into a bigger role, that is really difficult. RJ Barrett was not the first option in New York. Had he been the first option in New York, I think he would have been more successful. Weirdly enough, his entire game is designed for first, second option stuff. It isn't until he came to Toronto, in my opinion, that he's really started to work on his second, third, fourth option stuff. Now he's talking about defending, doing all the little things, being a better rebounder, being a better cutter. Guess what? That's all fourth, fifth option stuff. And that's not to say RJ can't become a first option or a second option at some point in his NBA career. That might still be there. But right now, you're not the first option on this team. And you're going to be asked to do valuable things around. And now that you can show those things, not only do the Raptors get a more complete player, not only does RJ become a better player, but you're also bridging in all those questions that other teams that might want to trade for RJ will have. How does he fit without the basketball? Well, now you have oodles and oodles of sample data of him catching and shooting threes where he didn't have the ball, but he's a finisher on the play, or becoming a screener, like a better screener, or maybe taking the toughest matchup and actually holding his own. Like we've seen players get better defensively. We certainly have. I've seen Donovan Mitchell become a great defender to a bad defender to a great defender. I've seen defenders go up and down. I've seen Pascal Siakam regress to God knows what. You know, defense is a matter of, effort, energy, as well as physics. RJ has the physical tools to become a better defender. So you have to be able to look at a player who's a non-defender and say, do they have the tools to become a defender? Do they have the will to actually get there? When Kevin O'Neal came to Toronto, he had a vision of turning Vince Carter into one of the best defenders in the league. Didn't happen. The will has to be there. The will to actually guard and be a great defender has to be there. And that is up to the athlete to decide for themselves if they are willing to commit to that end. So I just think that the Toronto Raptors have done a great job of projecting, seeing what isn't there with a lot of these prospects. And I think that's very commendable. 100 versions of the same player. I made a live, that wasn't a live, it was a video. It was a very decently edited video, the cover of which is ironically Ben Simmons, in which I said every busts 101, what we don't understand about players who bust. Now, Ben Simmons isn't necessarily the poster child for busts. Maybe Kwame Brown is. But I wonder what Darko Rajakovic would do with an 18-year-old Kwame Brown. I really do. Because Kwame wasn't against getting better. I just think his development was totally screwed up. I wonder what a Darko Milicic, who, again, to this day, for all the good things he's done in his basketball career, for what he became, is only ever remembered as a terrible basketball player who was picked ahead of future Hall of Famers. I wonder what a 17-year-old Darko Milicic would look like with a coach like Darko Rajakovic. I wonder if he would have been able to connect to him. I wonder if he would have been able to turn him into a 5-time All-Star. The truth is, you don't know that Darko Milicic couldn't have been an All-Star. All you know is that he didn't become one. You don't know that Carmelo Anthony couldn't have been a bust. All you know is he wasn't a bust. We only see the version of the player that becomes. We don't see the versions that we miss. I was very high on Andrea Bargnani, very high. And this is like the one thing I'll say 100%. I stood 10 toes down for Andrea. I thought Andrea was awesome. I thought all the rebounding stuff was a little overrated. I thought he had great potential as a switchable big. I thought he could stretch the floor with the best of them. And I saw this guy get worse and worse and worse until the player that I'd seen at Benetton Treviso was just a distant memory. Sometimes, as a person who continued to believe in Andrea even 4 years after he had clearly failed in the NBA, I would sometimes watch those Benetton highlights and see, where is that joy? Where is that passion? Where is that mobility? Where is all of it? His development was completely mishandled. He was asked to bulk up to become a center, which effectively took away the best part about him, which was his speed. And he was asked to be this low block rebounding center, which he never was. And you took away all the switchability, all the mobility, all the handle, the passing. My God, Andrea was like, they called him Il Mago, which means, translates in Italian to the magician. They used to call him the magician for a reason. They were calling him that when he was 18, 19 years old, because he was just such a good passer. And they took the ball out of his hands. And then they added Hito Turkoglu to the mix. Andrea's development is the absolute nightmare of developments. And I watched it happen in real time. I watched the prospect that I really thought would be incredible and like maybe a multi-time all-star turn into a whipping boy for Prima Pasta. And I'm just so glad, you know, I don't have to do that with Darko Rajakovic, because he would never let an Andrea Bargnani fail. He would see immediately all the talent. He would connect with the player. He would harness that talent. And, you know, you think Brian Colangelo is an idiot now because he picked Markelle Fultz and he picked Andrea Bargnani first overall twice. But please let me remind you, it's the same GM who picked Sean Marion and Amari Stoudemire. He picked a lot of great players in the draft. He was a great, great evaluator of talent. This is also the same guy who traded for Kyle Lowry. He's the same guy who drafted DeMar DeRozan. I mean, I tell you, Brian Colangelo did a lot more good than bad, but he's only remembered for the bad because that's how the media wants to present it. But I think that it's important to realize that when a player succeeds and when a player fails, there's a version of reality in which that outcome was different. And it's important to give credit to the variables that worked well for that player to succeed. Because something that I have learned in my life is that nobody fails by themselves, nobody succeeds by themselves. Moving on to one of the final points of this live, which is no tank. Sorry. I'm sorry to tell you that unless the Raptors do something egregious, like start Bruno Fernando at point guard, you're probably not going to be bad enough to tank for a top 5 pick. That's the bad news. But the good news is you've shown a really, really good track record of finding talent outside of top 5, and this draft is full of it. I would not be surprised if whoever the Raptors draft, whether it's 7th, 10th, 12th, 15th, 16th, ends up being a top 5 player in the draft. So the question then becomes, if you find Nikola Jokic at 41, does it matter that you didn't find Nikola Jokic at 4th? I don't think so. Do we have to adjust the timeline? I think this is a really I think this should be the beef of the beef of the live, and I realize that the Raptors play in 4 hours, so I'll have a lot more to say about, what I have to save my voice, man. I've been talking like 6 hours a day, but I do want this to be the final thing, timeline adjustments. Does what we've seen so far adjust the timeline for this team? I don't think it adjusts the timeline for this team, but I do think it adjusts the calculus a little bit. Let me explain. So right now, you had a whole bunch of variables, and as the games go forward, you'll start to get clearer ideas of how close Jamal Shed and Jonathan Mobo and these guys are to actually being good players. I'll tell you a player that was picked in the second round who was an almost immediate contributor, Herb Jones. Herb Jones changed the calculus of the New Orleans Pelicans because they had solved their starting small forward spot for the next 10 years with basically the 30, what was he, 31st, 36th, 35th pick. Trey Murphy, Trey Murphy the third changed the calculus for the New Orleans Pelicans. Again, he was good on day one, but he was 17th overall pick in a pretty good draft. And the fact that he was super NBA ready and the fact that he was an older rookie, again, David Griffin, one of my favorite GMs. I think I have the same brain as him because I like all the same players he does. I like Trey. I like Herb. I like Eve Macy. I like Jordan Hawkins. Every time I like a player, David Griffin picks him. I would love to meet him. I'm going to have to schedule an interview at some point. But it's so interesting to me how these wins on the margins change the calculus. Let me tell you why it changes the calculus. Because young players are not supposed to be good ever. They're just not supposed to be good. You're not supposed to get like valuable winning minutes from a rookie. So when you do, and that rookie is locked up for 3 years, at least barring injury and barring unforeseen regression, you now have a spot on your roster that typically takes $7 to $8 million, maybe even upwards of $20 million. You're getting excess value on a very cheap deal that is secured long term. When Scotty Barnes showed that he was good on day one instead of a project and a zero level scorer, it changed the calculus for the Toronto Raptors. They were suddenly willing to trade off a first round pick to get Thaddeus Young. They were willing to even potentially trade a first round pick for Jakob Poeltl the year later because they'd already found that foundational superstar piece. They just needed to put the pieces around him to help him flourish. I think that's something that a lot of people just don't understand is like Scotty playing small ball center was not good for his developments. They almost had to get him a center. I just don't think they needed to spend what they spent on Jakob Poeltl. But nevertheless, the point is once you have your foundational pieces, you have to nurture them. So now the question becomes, what if Emmanuel quickly has taken a step? And I think he has. What if RJ Barrett has continued to take the step, which I think he has? And what if Scotty Barnes actually has a good game at some point? Because he hasn't had a great game so far. And when he starts rolling with better help and his teammates coming back slowly, I think when you start to figure out, shoot, we are actually good enough to make the playoffs, but we might just miss it if we because of Bruno Fernando and maybe Davion Mitchell and some of the missing pieces. I think you can start to move your timeline up a little bit or back, however you want to think of that. RJ Barrett is in his 5th season. Scotty Barnes is in his 4th season. No, RJ's in his 6th season. Emmanuel Quickly's in his 5th season. Scotty's in his 4th. Like these are not players in their 1st or 2nd season. These are players who are in the seasons that they're expected to win. I mean, if you want to look at it, look at the Orlando Magic. Paolo's in his 3rd season. Franz is in his 4th season. Jalen Suggs is in his 4th season. Anthony Black's in his 2nd season. Like the core pieces there are really young, and they're actually younger than your core pieces, and they're expected to win. But the way they're winning is they have Wendell Carters, and they have Jonathan Isaacs and Cole Anthony's, and you have rookies in those spots. So the question is no skip steps. So you must navigate two things at once. You do not want at any point for this team to start suspecting that you are losing on purpose. You just don't, because they didn't work as hard as they did last night and to lose this season. Trust me, they didn't. They're not going out there, and I told you before the season started, this is not a team, like, as locked in as connected they are, they're not coming out to lose 60 games just so you can fancy Cooper Flag. These guys don't give a shit about Cooper Flag. That's competitive sports. And honestly, if they cared about getting Cooper Flag, they're losers. They shouldn't care. You should care, maybe as a fan. Maybe you can fantasize about Cooper Flag and watch his Duke games this year. But they are not supposed to care. They are prideful professionals. They should not be looking at a 19-year-old and saying Cooper Flag is going to save our franchise. You save your franchise. We'll let the Cooper Flag thing fall where it may. So right now, you look at this roster, there's a couple of holes, and I think that you might just have solutions at them. Number one major hole going into the season was backup point guard. I think between Jamal Shed and Davion Mitchell, you might have one. I don't know which one completely. Jamal is clearly the more talented player, in my opinion. He's the younger player. He's the smarter player in terms of the pick and roll reads. But Davion is the more physically advanced player and probably the less error prone player right now in light of Jamal's 7 turnover game last night. And he's the better shooter. But Jamal could progress on that level. And I think between the two of them, you would say split the difference. That's a backup point guard. Maybe you go matchup dependent. Some nights you see if one has it, if he doesn't have it, you go to the other guy. I don't know. And DJ Carton is no slouch. DJ Carton is like a pretty damn good fourth string point guard. Like between the three of those guys, I think you have something. And if all else fails, you have Scotty Barnes, right? You have Scotty Barnes and RJ Barrett who can handle some playmaking load. You have Kelly Olynyk who can handle some playmaking load. So it's not like you're sunk. So I think even if you don't have a Tyus Jones or a Malik Monk, or Malik's more like it's 1-2. Just because you don't have a Peyton Pritchard doesn't mean it's going to sink your season. Okay. The other thing that we had an issue with was overall talent depth, right? And I think a lot of that's going to come down to how quickly Jakob Poeltl can do anything of consequence in the NBA. If he's like 2 years away, I think it changes your calculus. And I also think I would like to see Grady in a more optimal role for himself. Grady is the ultimate like fourth player, right? He might progress to more. He might become a third player, second player. I doubt he ever becomes a first best player on a team, but right now he's like the fourth or fifth player. And right now, he's having some very, very difficult shots. Like, I would bet his shot quality is like in the floor right now because teams are really honing in on him. When he's on the court or when even Jamison Battle's on the court, they're being geared up on in ways that they won't be able to when Emmanuel Quickly and RJ Barrett are back. So I'm very curious to see that. But if all of those things are going well, then the one question is backup big. And that was like big, big question because you don't get Christian Koloko, who still has yet to be cleared. You have Kelly Olynyk, who proved last year that he can't handle that role. You've lost Jonte Porter because of the betting scandal. And now you have Bruno Fernando. And there's no obvious answer as to how you get that backup big. You prey on growth from Ulrich Shamshay. That's not happening this year. You trade for one. I don't necessarily think that's the worst option. You play Chris Boucher. That could work. That could work. Chris Boucher has been a productive part of a decent team before. Chris Boucher was a vital part of a 48-win Toronto Raptors team. Darko just has to learn to trust him, and he has to learn to earn that trust from Darko. He can't have one bad game, one good game, one bad game, one good game. But where do you go when Chris Boucher is having one of those normal, Chris Boucher games where he's just making a ton of errors? Well, I think Jonathan Mobo might be the answer. Now, Jonathan Mobo obviously is more of a wing than a big at the NBA level from a size perspective, but I think his skill set is very suited to being a big. I think his rim protection is very decent. And I think the fact that he can switch allows you to do things defensively that are just very unique. The fact that he'll be sharing so much time with Scotty is a problem because neither one of them have super gravity as shooters right now. Scotty has to become a much better shooter this year, and I think he'll get there at some point, but it hasn't come through yet. And teams are not respecting his jump shot. They're almost like, "We dare you." And he showed it in that Boston preseason game. What happens when he starts becoming a threat to shoot is everybody gets open. And that was like one of the most superstar games I've ever seen from Scotty. And I know it was preseason, but if he can't do that for the second unit, that second unit is going to struggle. So what you need to compensate for Scotty and Scotty and Jonathan is an abundance of shooting around them. And I think that's where a guy like Jakob Poeltl or even a guy like Grady Dick potentially sliding over to the bench with Ochai moving into the starting lineup, maybe even staggering some of those minutes with Emmanuel quickly, maybe trading your mid-level exception for an upgrade. Kelly Olynyk being a big who can actually shoot. Hopefully he can shoot. Maybe Bruce Brown has rediscovered his jump shot to some extent. I think there's something here. I think the piece that doesn't fit really is Bruce Brown. I think there's a little bit of redundancy between him and Ochai, Jacoby, etc. So, if at this point, if all he's going to do is get in the way, then Bruce Brown is a very interesting expiring that you could use potentially in conjunction with a Chris Boucher to get a massive help. What does that massive help look like? I'm not sure yet. But whatever it is, if it is an upgrade on these guys and it is a reasonable contract and it allows some of your other pieces to slide into more optimal places on the roster, then I think that there's a chance that your timeline could be adjusted up a year. So right now, I made a video, remember a few months, 6 months ago, the Raptors will be contenders by 2026. Okay. Well, we're in 2024, heading into 2025. So obviously, I was very, very optimistic about the Raptors' future at that moment. I don't think you get to contention by 2025, but how awesome would it be if the Toronto Raptors, with this super ragtag young group featuring three players in your core three, well, actually four players in your core four, if you're going to include Grady Dick, that are all under the age of 25, all getting better, all under the supervision of a great development staff. What if that team could be a sneaky playoff team this year? What if they make seventh or sixth and actually do a good job against the New York Knicks? They steal a couple of games. Okay. Now you have draft picks next summer. You have assets next summer. You have expirings next summer. And you've locked up all these players. Grady is not extension issue right now. All these rookies that are progressing, they're not extension issues. You have a window here to get a massive win now piece, even if that means trading your pick, which I'm not necessarily for or against. I'm putting it out there. There's picks that can be traded to establish something in your starting lineup, potentially. It could be an upgrade on Jakob Poeltl. It could be an upgrade on Grady Dick. It could be a swap out with a massive upgrade on an RJ Barrett or Emmanuel Quickly. The only thing that's for sure is Scotty's not getting traded. Last night, Lane and I went back and forth on who was safe and who was not. The one thing we'll both agree on is that Scotty Barnes ain't going nowhere. But apart from that, I don't think Emmanuel Quickly's going anywhere. I really don't. I don't think Ulrich is going anywhere. I don't think Grady's going anywhere. I don't think Jacoby's going anywhere. I don't think Shed is going anywhere. I think these guys are here for the long run. But the point is, if you, in this day and age, where the cap is going, how much it's exploding, if you get this much value out of rookie contracts, it allows you to take on a player, maybe even overpay a player, like a Brandon Ingram, potentially. I'm not saying Brandon Ingram, but I'm saying like a Brandon Ingram. It allows you to take a chance on a player like that elevates your ceiling so much and makes you just that much better. And again, if you are thinking tank Scotty 25 point per game season, I think you're missing the sort of bigger vision of what Scotty is as a player. Scotty would thrive next to a player like Brandon Ingram. He won't thrive in the box score. He'll thrive in the impact metrics. He'll thrive if you give Scotty Brandon Ingram plus RJ Barrett plus Emmanuel Quickly. Holy shit, man. This guy is going to create the nicest looks that these guys have ever had in their lives. He is going to be averaging like 11 assists, 10 rebounds, and like 18 to 19 points a game. And you may not fancy that. You may say, no, 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 no. The only version of reality I'm willing to live with is Scotty averages 25, 8, and 8. That's one way to go about it. And certainly he can do that in the playoff series. But right now, I think the best thing to do is to put Scotty with players who can actually compete, who can be viable shooters and scorers. And when you see what he's doing for Ochai Agbaji and Davion Mitchell and Jamal Shed, you just wonder what he could do for players with even more natural talent. I think at this point, again, you just see how much Tyrese Maxey struggled last night, right? 6 for 23. Give me a W if you caught Tyrese Halliburton having 0 points. Sometimes it's hard. When you're a natural playmaker or you're not someone who generates advantages out of thin air, it's really hard to play with a lack of space in the NBA, especially with how they're letting people play right now. So even Anthony Edwards in the first game against the Lakers, when he had to go up against the Lakers, he shot, I think he 27 points on 25 shots or 25 points on 27 shots. It was a very inefficient game, right? Hal saying Zach Levine. Maybe. Maroon Prince saying an upgrade on Jakob accomplishes a lot. Hanbo Liu saying Scotty is our upper limit. Sure. I think overall, this team is in a really good holding pattern, right? Where you have all these young players. Like, again, Jonathan Mobo is cheap for 3 years. If he gives you actual positive value on even the middle of this contract, he doesn't have to do it this year, but by next year, if he's like a positive, if Ochai is a positive, you're gonna get him cheap because Ochai hasn't done shit. And so far in the NBA, he hasn't done a lot. So even if he does well this year in his role, you're gonna get him at a really good role player salary. You're not getting him as a star player, right? You're gonna get him at like 3 years, 18 million, 3 years, 20 million, that kind of deal on the very, very low end. Because I mean, we just saw DeLon Wright, Gary Trent. You have all these players, and you have an entire league that is super capped out. Like just everyone is just financially fucked across the league. There are very few teams that are going to be able to offer Ochai Agbaji 10, $12 million a year. You know what I mean? Like if he pops for you. You get my point? Like you have got all these players on your team that that will serve to have a tremendous amount of value on winning. And I think it will allow you, again, when you've taken care of the back of your roster, when you look at the Denver Nuggets play, I watched the Denver Nuggets play, covered the game, and I thought it was amazing how much of a difference, even when you have a star like Nikola Jokic, who is just leaps and bounds better than anyone who plays for the Toronto Raptors right now, that even he cannot do shit when there's no spacing around. He had 16 points. His team got blown out by like, I think 15, 20 points by the OKC Thunder. He couldn't do anything because, again, you don't have options. And he has max players on his team. He has Jamal Murray, Michael Porter Jr., Aaron Gordon. He has, Russell Westbrook. Like he has a lot of players like that. A lot of people would say are better than Jamison Battle on his team. He's not playing with G Leaguers. He's not playing with rookies. But the fact that Peyton Watson is not respected as a three-point shooter and is willing to go 0 for 4, the fact that Christian Brown is not creating any sort of havoc, the loss of KCP, Bruce Brown, and Jeff Green hurts that team so much, but it doesn't hurt as much as obviously the Jamal Murray equation, right? Jamal Murray just not being as unguardable as he used to be. It's all in the margins. People think only in terms of stars and draft picks. They think of stars, they think of first overall picks and high lottery picks. I don't think that's the way you win in the NBA. And if you want any evidence of that, let's call it the Bruce Brown effect, right? Like which Bruce Brown you gonna get? If you get Denver Bruce Brown, if you're the Toronto Raptors right now, man, it's gonna be really, really hard to not win 40 games because that's a hell of a player. Those are the players that help you win basketball games. So if you look at the Orlando Magic signing KCP for 20 million, well, what if you have 4 KCP level type role players on your team, but you have them locked up on rookie contracts? See what I mean? So I do think that it adjusts the timeline by 1 year. So I think if I'm the Toronto Raptors, I'm thinking like wait and see, of course. Like this is way too small a sample size. 2 games, you beat a team that was depleted, very strong, very offensively deficient Philly team, and you had to get to the line like 500 times just to make it work. You couldn't hit a three. Yeah, there's plenty of issues, and believe me, right now I'm getting ahead of it before we get behind it. There's a very good chance that the Toronto Raptors get absolutely blistered tonight, blown out of the water by the Minnesota Timberwolves, and we lose by 25, and everyone's back to this sucks. I would encourage you to not live and die on wins and losses, makes and misses, but rather just look at how Jonathan Mobile competes on a switch with Anthony Edwards, how Scotty Barnes is reading advantages, and just imagine if RJ Barrett does not play tonight, what an upgrade RJ Barrett cutting on the back line would have been over an Ochai Agbaji. Imagine what the spacing would look like for Scotty if it was Emmanuel Quickly instead of Davion Mitchell. Because again, we're trying to build good basketball minds here. We need to be projectors.
We cannot be, reacting to every single win and loss like crazy people, right? We just can't. Like yesterday, it was not about the win. I didn't care about the win. I care about how they won. It doesn't matter to me that they won yesterday. It doesn't matter to me that they lost their home opener. It won't matter to me if they win or lose tonight. And frankly, this entire season is just an entire wash for me in terms of I don't care about the wins and losses this year. I refuse to give a shit about whether the Raptors win 20 games this year, 40 games, or 50 games this year. If they win 50, probably something great happened. If they win 20, it probably means that they tried to tear it down. That's not the point. The point is, this is never about this year. This is about this year going forward and what these players look like going forward and what you need to put in place for these players to be successful. As much as I would love for these players to go spend time in the 905, spend time developing, get a run at the plan, maybe have a competitive in-season tournament, I think it would be invaluable to have a 7-game playoff series where you can really see a Jonathan Mobo, where you can really see what these guys look like in tight quarters when they're scouted to death, when a team has like a full week to prepare for every one of your tendencies. I think it would be also great to understand who you have in RJ Barrett and Emmanuel Quickly. Emmanuel Quickly struggled immensely the last time the Knicks were in the playoffs. Immensely. RJ Barrett has looked amazing in the playoffs. Scotty Barnes has also looked amazing in the playoffs. It'd be great to see if Scotty Barnes' first option looks good in the playoffs. It'll really help his training next year. And how do you weigh the gap between a 16th pick and a 12th pick? Well, I would say this. Is Jonathan Mobo better than a lot of players who were picked in the 20s, picked in the teens? Do you think he should be? Do you think Jamal Shed at 45 is a better pick than a lot of players who are going to be picked in the 20s? Like who do you think is a better player right now? Isaiah Collier picked 29th or Jamal Shed picked at 45th? I'll tell you who was better in college. I'll tell you who was much better in college and who's been so far much better in the NBA. That's the point, man. These picks are separated by like 4, 5, whatever. I trust the Raptors to draft really well at 17 or 16. I trust them to draft very well with that Portland pick. And I trust the youth that currently exists on this team. And I'll trust their 3 draft picks in 2025. I don't care about high draft picks, man. I don't. DFJ Hoops, salute pen. Y'all whipped our behinds last night. I don't know if y'all follow Liv, the Denver Nuggets commentator. She's really cool. She predicted that the Sixers would not. I think she predicted the Sixers wouldn't make the playoffs. I think that's a little too far. I was very high on the Sixers. I was trying to get over my Joel Embiid bashing and hate. Watching them yesterday, I'm not necessarily sold that they're going to miss the playoffs, but I'm adjusting my expectations on how good I think that team is going to be for sure. SP saying, watch the game on mute. You'll see it a lot better. I 100% agree with you. 100%, 1000% agree with you. If you watch it on mute in like total silence, you will watch the game much better because you'll be less focused on the things that they're telling you to focus on. And you'll be more focused on the things that you want to be focused on. And if you really, really watch it close, I would watch how the Raptors defend the pick and roll. Like how they defended it last night was awesome. Michael saying, did anyone see the video of Joel sniffing his butt? Yeah, that's allegedly a part of his new free throw routine. It's very weird. Anyways, I'll catch you guys after the game. Any support to this channel goes a long way, but hit the like on your way out. It would help us tremendously. 311 people in here. I hope we can get this video to 311 likes. That'd be awesome. Talk to you guys later. Again, see you after the game. It's a late game tonight, just for those of you who don't know. It's 8 o'clock game, Minnesota Timberwolves, and we will have you covered. And I can't wait because this is going to be the 3rd time I'm watching the Minnesota Timberwolves. And this is the first time that I am watching, this is the first time in a long time where I'm watching both teams that I'm super dialed in on. You know what I mean? So I think that'll lend a lot of credibility and maybe a lot of insight into the analysis because I not only have a really good read on what the Timberwolves have done this offseason and the players they traded for, but also the games they've already played. So I can speak more to the tendencies of the Wolves and maybe even make a more educated opinion about who's actually playing well and who's not playing well because I'm actually watching this team a lot this year. And it'll be the same thing if the Raptors play the OKC Thunder. I'm just choosing to watch a hell of a lot more basketball this year. Just generally, I'm going to be a junkie this year. I'm in basketball absorption mode. Everything I'm doing right now is basketball between the panel, Pinstar basketball. I'm just like 100% zoned in. God bless Asperger's. I am just zoned in on basketball. So when I'm not sleeping, I am absorbing basketball. I'm watching basketball podcasts. I'm reading about basketball. Everything's basketball. My goal, obviously, this year is just to become like the best analyst I can be. Talk to you guys later, man.